In the centre of my hat, I have the Aboriginal flag. The black is the people walking on the red earth, and the sun is eternal.
I've come to Coogee Beach in Sydney to see something that would have been unimaginable 35 years ago when I left Australia. Now tell me what this installation, or whatever we call it, is.
Well, this is the Sea of Hands.
Yeah.
This is the largest public participatory work of art ever done in Australia.
I could well imagine, yeah. It gets bigger, doesn't it? I mean, how many?
Bigger.
How many?
120,000 hands.
120,000 hands.
Have several names, at least 2 on each hand, so we've got at least 250,000 names. These are people who are saying, I put up my hand to support reconciliation.
Right.
I want the government of Australia to reconcile with the Indigenous folks of Australia.
Yeah.
Now, that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's a huge reconciliation symbol.
Reconciliation is the new buzzword of Australian politics. It implies that white Australia must apologise to the Aborigines, and in terms the Aborigines will accept. In the 1950s, the hot political issue here was communism. Today, it's race. If we can't or won't deal with that, it's argued, we can't hope to move forward as a unified nation, even though the Aborigines are less than 2% of us.
We're standing here on Darawal land. It is the correct protocol for us to be welcomed onto the land. Merv is the present chairperson of the Currannulla Aboriginal Corporation. Merv is going to do a welcome to country to us this afternoon. Merv Ryan.
Thank you, Peter. I'm happy to be able to come down here and do this welcome and to look at all this. I reckon it's incredible. On behalf of our elders, I'd like to welcome you to the Darawal land and pay respects to the land. Thank you.
Most of the Australians who want to apologise to Aborigines are white city liberals. Well, though apologies are nice to give and nice to get, they are cheap, non-binding and guarantee nothing. They only become an issue when people refuse to make them, and the present Australian government flatly refuses.
We have a major hurdle, Bob. It's no good pretending that we don't. Without the Prime Minister and the government on side, we have a major struggle to achieve reconciliation. But there are many Australians who are determined to achieve it.
I have the impression that an awful lot of Australians, maybe even the majority of Australians, aren't actually on your side. They tend to regard Australian Aborigines as being a bunch of thievish, ignorant welfare bludgers who are played upon by a minority of black demagogues, and especially they're opposed to the idea of apology because they say, look, this happened in my grandfather's time, I didn't do it. It has nothing to do with me. How do you answer them?
How many people said they were sorry when you had a car accident, Bob?
I got a lot of expression of sympathy, and they had nothing to do with my accident.
Nothing to do with your accident at all, and yet they were able to put themselves in your position to understand the horror and the distress and the suffering that you had, and they felt sorry. That's all that Aboriginal people are asking. They're not asking people to accept guilt or to accept blame. They're simply saying, please understand our position.
When I was growing up, this is what I thought an Aborigine was. This is what they did. I had no way of knowing otherwise. The Australia of my youth was, in effect, racially segregated. We grafted the image of the noble savage onto Aborigines as a form of compensation. And we still like to see them in this way. Here in Alice Springs, going native is a basic part of the tourist itinerary. But to the very first Europeans, they looked a lot less edifying. The inhabitants of this country are the miserablest people in the world. And leaving aside their human shape, they do differ but little from brutes. These words by a 17th century English buccaneer became the template for all the miseries that whites in Australia inflicted upon blacks. The land grabs, the denial of rights, the massacres, the lot. As land-hungry settlers began to fill up the continent, they carried with them the seeds of Aboriginal devastation. There was plenty of resistance, but not enough to turn back the tide. Massacre was routine, disease and displacement thinned the numbers, so that by the end of the 19th century, it was widely believed that the Australian Aborigines were a dying race. The prospect of extinction was brought nearer by what seemed to have happened to the Aborigines on the island of Tasmania.
The museum was established back in 1976, and this is the keeping place of Tasmanian Aboriginal art.
The story with a twist is told to visitors every day by tour guide Darryl Medcraft.
William Lanny died in 1869 of European diseases. At the time of his death, there was a very strong lobby group of scientists in Tasmania, and they were doing terrible experiments on people. They stole his corpse, they severed his hands and his feet and sent them to England for scientific experiments. And as a trophy of their job well done, so they thought, they made a tobacco pouch from his scrotum.
The native population was never large, but it waged a very successful guerrilla war against the white invaders under cover of the dense Tasmanian forests. And the anxious settlers beseeched the government to have the Aborigines removed from the land. And it was a missionary who gradually rounded up the dwindling population. The last 120 were brought here to a compound on Flinders Island. They weren't allowed to go out and hunt. Instead, they were taught to play cricket. After 15 years of despair on Flinders, they were a threat to nobody. Less than 50 remained. They were brought back to the mainland. When William Lanny, known as King Billy, died, it seemed that only one was left, Truganini. This modest bronze carbuncle is all the monument that Truganini received. She died on the 8th of May, 1876 in Hobart. And her one desire was that she should not be given over to the surgeons to dissect her the way they had cut up King Billy. She wanted to be buried at sea. But the white Tasmanians had other plans for her. They boiled her body down, cleaned down the bones, wired them together, and stuck them in a glass case in the Hobart Museum, where they remained until well into my own lifetime. The chances of staying untouched by white intrusion seemed increasingly small, even in the remotest parts of the country, here in the central western desert. The last nomadic people to have slipped the net were called the Pintabee. They were contacted in the 1950s. There were maybe 100 Pintabee left living on their homeland, an area the size of France. This is the man who found them. Jeremy Long was a government patrol officer employed to make contact with the Pintabee and to move them to newly established communities hundreds of miles to the east. This was part of a nationwide government policy of Aboriginal resettlement. But in drought-stricken regions like this, it was also a rescue mission. Jeremy Long ended his patrols confident that all those still alive had been contacted. Life before trousers had come to an end. Or had it? When the explorer and historian Dick Kimber returned to the region nearly 20 years later, he began to wonder.
On one occasion, we were driving along, we'd stopped on a faint track, and there was quite a clear footprint right nearby. And one of the Aboriginal people with me said, you know, in quite a almost a frightened way. Hey, old walkabout blackfella here. So I had an awareness that there was a chance of a certain small group of Pintupi people still living out in the general Lake Mackay area, far beyond all notions of contact.
Dick's suspicions were right. A few Pintupi had survived in the desert all this time, completely isolated from the outside world. This small family group has become legendary. They were the last uncontacted Aboriginal people in the whole of Australia, now known as the Bush Mob. For the first time ever, they've let us go back with them to where they used to live in the desert.
Ini tinggi mirkan arko raja urko manori yang kaya koran. Mirkan apa jangan arko dia nak kuarnya miri jena boleh.
The Bush Mob were relatives of the groups who had left with Jeremy Long. They stayed behind. Only the father had ever experienced contact with the wider world, and he had hated it. Under the old man's influence, the group avoided any further contact. He had 2 wives, and they raised 7 children. A generation grew up with no real knowledge of life outside their own world, except for the very occasional sight of strangers.
Ayo ko kang keluar kalau macam jalan no. Kamu lihat. Udah jangan wajar mana no uyan. Jangan lah, jangan udah jalan jangan ada pura.
But by the early 1980s, it was harder to sustain their isolation if they were to survive. The children had grown, and custom required marriage partners from outside their group. And then, suddenly, there was another change.
As time passed, the old man died, and therefore one of the anchoring elements of the group was lost. That must have brought them to the idea of making outside contact.
Like countless Aborigines before them, the Bush Mob had no idea what they might find when they walked off their homelands. A century before, when people had done the same, there was a new tribe approaching across the landscape. A white tribe, whose intentions, for once, were benign.
Yeah, I'm Pastor Thomas Bermond. I've been here for not quite 2 years yet, and I'm serving here the people at Hermansburg. About 80%, 90% of them are Aboriginal people, and most of them would see themselves as Lutheran Christians.
Hermansburg was one of the first Christian mission stations set up at the end of the 19th century. It was meant as a beacon, a magnet, for those who were curious or desperate enough to approach.
Some people saw the Aboriginal people like animals, and therefore they could be hunted like animals. They wouldn't even see them as humans. That was not the attitude of the missionaries. I suppose they saw them as people who had been made by God, who ought to be treated like them. And overall, the history has been a positive one, and the people that talk to me, the older people, they say that we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the mission.
But as was often the way with missionaries, sanctuary came at a price. Success was measured in saved souls. The church set out to break down Aboriginal custom and belief, and they did so far more effectively than any white group before. Was that so bad? Not necessarily. Traditional tribal law could be appallingly tyrannous and unjust.
Aboriginal way is better too hard. You'll get killed when you get into trouble or taking someone's woman or breaking the Aboriginal law, you'll get killed for that one. That's right, I thought it's easier Christian way.
Naturally, many of the converts were playing the missionaries along. A bit of manual labour and a few hours lip service at prayer meetings was a fair price for food, especially in times of famine. But the Lutherans were persistent. Their focus was on the young, on education, and gradually a Christian community emerged. Government thinking about Aborigines began to shift to more missionary lines. The reports of extinction had been exaggerated. Now policy turned to a different kind of disappearance. Traditional law and identity were to be bleached out in order to raise the status of Aboriginals to that of whites. This meant the mass assimilation of natives into white culture.
In its essence, I suppose it was making Aboriginal people white, was the focus and integrating in our society and eventually just disappearing. I suppose that's always been the policy, trying to make the Aboriginal problem go away. And it hasn't gone away, and I don't think it ever will.
The most barefaced and extreme of assimilation projects was the removal of mixed-race Aboriginal children from their natural mothers to be raised as whites. They were taken to orphanages, to missions, and to live with white adoptive parents. These children have come to be known as the stolen generation. Their stories have only recently come to light, and nobody seemed to know or care back when they were happening. One of the more public ones is that of the opera singer Deborah Cheetham, who has turned her experiences into a performance which she's rehearsing at the Sydney Opera House. Deborah, how old were you when you were taken from your mother?
Just 3 weeks old. I really, truly believed that I'd been abandoned. I was told that I'd been left in a cardboard box in a field, sort of a la Moses in the bulrushes, if you like.
Moses in the bulrushes, yes.
Well, it was a church orphanage, after all.
Was your relation with your adopted mother, on the whole, a happy one?
Yes, I'd have to say that I've really had a very privileged upbringing. But beyond that, truly parents who did love me and took very great care of me, gave me every chance in life.
Deborah's love of music was instilled at the Baptist church she attended every weekend. She grew up not knowing about the other side to her identity. It must have been hard to know what an Aboriginal was growing up in that kind of a family.
Almost impossible. The only Aboriginals that I was aware of were the cement ones that were put in the garden of our next door neighbour, with the sort of little red loincloth and the spear.
See, I used to think that an Aboriginal was something by some person designed by Eric Jolliffe, who spent his time chucking boomerangs down at Cornell, but I'd never met one.
No, well, neither had I. Not until...
That's even more surprising.
Yeah, well, it's... I don't know.
It was a chance meeting with a cousin at one of her concerts that suddenly brought home to her the reality of her other family.
Just that, not the arpeggio.
Through this encounter, Deborah met them all, and most importantly, her mother.
Okay.
They didn't like each other much when they met.
Find something here.
I think they found me to be a middle-class, self-opinionated lesbian snob, really. And as far as I was concerned, this woman had abandoned me when I was 3 weeks old. So why now would we suddenly be able to bond? And indeed we didn't.
I mean, the point is I'm meant to be...
So when did that begin to change?
Getting from that to the
Not till 9 years later, actually.
Good Lord.
One of my Aboriginal brothers died of a heroin overdose. I actually left that funeral with a letter in my hand that had been written by Monica, my Aboriginal mother, 3 years before I received it. And I read the letter, and it basically outlined her side of the story.
When you were born, I had to live in a home for orphaned Aboriginal children. An officer in the Salvation Army had taken me in. Major Townsend told me that she would take care of you while I went and earned some money picking beans. When I returned, you were gone. That broke my heart. I was in shock. I couldn't get you back. I'm so sorry, babe, that I couldn't be with you when you needed me.
songs my mother taught me in the days long vanished, seldom from her eyelids were the teardrops banished.
The stolen generation is one of the most incendiary issues in Australian race politics today. John Howard's government has tried to deny its very existence. On the other side, it's been compared to the Holocaust. Both are nonsense. It was racist and unfeeling, but Nazi it was not. Some who helped carry it out feel that emotional outrage is clouding the reality of what happened. Les Pennell was a patrol officer in the Northern Territories responsible for removing children in the late 1940s.
The current debate on stolen children actually has got out of hand. To me, that is a highly emotive description, depicting something that didn't really happen. What happened was, of course, that these children were taken into care as a result of domestic violence or child abuse. Any child from a European father had any rights that it had under Aboriginal law extinguished at birth. Mixed-race children were basically neglected, and a lot of them were killed at birth because Aborigines didn't like them at all. The approach was purely and simply humanitarian. Everything was done in good faith. No one was forcibly removed.
There is an opinion that, well, it happened so long ago, this stolen generations story. Why should we be harping on about it now? Well, I'm a product of what happened all those years ago, and it's not so long ago.
Well, look at you, Deborah. You have a successful career. You're very much admired. What have you got to complain about?
I often liken it to being given a very expensive pair of Italian leather shoes. Everyone is envious of them, only they're one size too small. And you walk around in them all of your life, well, you're going to have scars.